and then I'll upload the recording online, and you can review it or share it with others. Makes a great Hanukkah gift. I'm going to mute us all now, just so that I can offer a blessing, which if you would like to share along with me, you may from your own home. The blessing is the traditional bracha, or blessing for the study of sacred literature. Any mitzvah in the Jewish tradition is framed with a blessing. And this blessing begins, like every other blessing over a mitzvah, up to the word vitzivanu. And then the last three words are words that we will review. La'asok b'divrei Torah, which means to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. And I'm writing it out in transliteration in the chat window so that you can follow along when we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. What a blessing it is indeed that we can study Torah together. So once again, welcome. So happy to have you, either for the first time or the first time in a long time. We did a summer mini-mester in August, paused just before Labor Day, went on hiatus through the holidays, and it is now the middle of the Sukkot festival. And as if on cue, it looks like the Sukkot rains that we've been praying for since the beginning of the festival are going to arrive. So that will set us up for next week's festival, starting on Sunday night, which is Simchat Torah, also Shmini Atzeret. We're not going to talk much about all of the fall holidays. The best way to experience the fall holidays is to do them. I'll make a few housekeeping announcements at the end of our session today. We go until 11:45. Again, if you have to leave early, if you want to come late, no judgment. We all are welcome. And I do tape every class. So we have been studying Pirkei Avot. This is one of a gazillion editions that I happen to have in my office. This is a particularly lovely and user-friendly one that was published by, I believe, the UAHC Press, which is the former press of the Union for Reform Judaism, when it was still the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Reform Movement's press, written by Lenny Kravitz, not the rock musician, Leonard Kravitz, professor of rabbinic literature at Hebrew Union College, and Kerry Olitsky, a wonderful rabbi, author, and friend, with a foreword by Rabbi Gunther Plaut of blessed memory. It's a wonderful, user-friendly, modern interpretation, commentary, and translation of Pirkei Avot. If you've never picked up your own copy of Pirkei Avot, this would be a fine example of one to enjoy, but there are countless others. And you can see that it's written in such a way that every page has the Pirkei Avot at the top, and then everything below the midpoint of the page is commentary. So there's lots of insight into the text itself. When you come to this class, the idea is that we, you and I together, supply the insights into the text. And sometimes we're aided by secondary source commentary and what have you. Most of the time we are working directly in the primary source. Pirkei Avot is the quintessential work of Jewish ethical literature. It is variously translated as, in like the old school translation of Pirkei Avot is the chapters of the fathers. You may have heard that. Or the wisdom of the ancestors might be a more modern and gender-sensitive way of translating Pirkei Avot without losing the literal sense of Pirkei Avot. Others have suggested that Pirkei Avot is not about fathers or forefathers or ancestors at all. Pirkei Avot literally means master teachings, a more idiomatic translation, right? Where Avot doesn't denote actual fathers or forefathers. It simply means like Big Daddy, like the Big Daddy teachings of the Jewish tradition. I sometimes colloquially refer to Pirkei Avot as the Poor Richard's Almanac of Judaism, or of the rabbinic literature. Not written by one person the way Ben Franklin authored Poor Richard's Almanac, but similar in style in that it is a compendium or an anthology of wise sayings, whose thrust in the aggregate seems to be all kinds of collected wisdom on how to lead a good life. Not necessarily a life that is hedonistically pleasurable, but a life that is good in the ethical domain, the way Judaism defines it. As we have been going through this text, and we're going to be picking up right where we left off, but newcomers to the class, please don't fret. The worst that happens is you can go back to, lesson 1. We've already taped a lot of our, I think we've taped 37 classes, though we didn't start with Pirkei Avot. We actually started with an introduction to Mishnah and read Mishnah Shabbat. I'll say more about what Mishnah is in a moment. For most of us, though, picking up at chapter 5, Mishnah number 18 or 19 is a perfectly fine place to begin, because one can read Pirkei Avot sequentially, but the nice thing about it is it's also a reference tool. You can literally pick and choose any teaching from the 6 chapters of Pirkei Avot and find something meaningful, approachable, and not requiring that you will have read a whole lot of the preceding material. So please don't fret that we're picking up in the 5th of 6 chapters, toward the end of the chapter 5, by the way. We'll probably get close to or at the end of chapter 5 today and start chapter 6 next week. If we don't quite get there, that's fine. We just go sequentially. But you can always either catch up or simply put your cares behind you that you're picking up in the middle, because the middle is a perfectly good place to begin, despite what Mary Poppins would say. So we are looking at Pirkei Avot, which, as an anthology of wise sayings, stands on its own and also is included in a larger corpus of rabbinic literature known as the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first systematic attempt to systematize Jewish thought and practice into a single digestible work of literature. It's not so digestible. The fact of the matter is this is the Mishnah. It is a 6-volume compendium of often mistakenly identified as Jewish law. I think of it more as Jewish thought, or even better, Jewish conversations, written by the earliest group of teachers to be identified in our tradition as rabbis, and including some teachers who are not given the title rabbi because they predate the period known as the Rabbinic period. In other words, there are certain wise sayings attributed to people like Hillel and Shammai. Hillel is certainly familiar to us because his name ended up on all the college campuses. Hillel is not a rabbi. He is often mistakenly referred to as Rabbi Hillel. If anyone says that, you can say, actually, Hillel was not a rabbi, but you don't need to say that. It's a little bit obnoxious to do that in mixed company. Hillel and Shammai date from the 1st century before the Common Era, which is the Jewish way of saying BC. We say BCE. They are not identified as rabbi because that term seems not to have been common parlance for master teacher in the BCE period. Starting at around the time of Jesus, and including in the New Testament literature referring to Jesus himself, the term rabbi becomes much more commonplace, meaning teacher. So Jesus is identified in the New Testament literature as rabbi, meaning teacher or my teacher, as are a number of the contemporaries of Jesus, starting in the first part of the 1st century of the Common Era, what our Christian friends call AD, or Anno Domini. The rabbis endeavor to make sense of a rapidly changing milieu in which Jews were no longer sovereign in the land of Israel, but rather were subjects of the Roman Empire. A Jewish rebellion in the late 60s of the 1st century CE further subjugated the Jewish people upon the failure of the rebellion and having it violently suppressed by Rome. Of course, the temple was destroyed in the year 70. The Jewish people were either assimilated into the Roman Empire, subjugated by the Roman Empire, became slaves under the Romans, or simply went about their daily lives just with less sovereign power, no military, no Jewish monarch or other ruler, except for ceremonial leaders who were basically installed and manipulated by the Romans. And that went on for another 65 years or so until, and by the way, that first Jewish rebellion ends with the catastrophic fall of Masada and the famous legend of the suicide of the holdouts, the zealots on top of Masada, is probably known to many of us. Some of us may have visited Masada. 60 some odd years later, Another Jewish rebellion led by a charismatic and self-proclaimed messianic figure named Bar Kokhba also results in disaster for the Jewish people, at which point we fully enter a period known as diaspora, where Jews are really no longer even permitted to be inside of the perimeter of what used to be called Jerusalem. The Romans renamed the city Aelia Capitolina. It is officially a pagan province of the Roman Empire, and Jews begin to spread out across the Mediterranean rim. But there were always groupings of Jews, and in particular, rabbinic colonies that remained in the Holy Land itself. It is in that milieu that a lot of this literature is produced, both out of an instinct, I think, or an impulse to preserve the Jewish way of life in writing with clear directions for Jewish posterity, and also out of a desire to evolve Judaism away from temple cult and agricultural observance, which was really the thrust of biblical Israelite religion. I don't easily refer to what our ancestors in biblical times practiced as Judaism. They would themselves not have called themselves Jews. They would have thought of themselves as Hebrews or Israelites, most likely. And even after they think of themselves as Jews, meaning from the province of, or the tribe of Judea, Judaism is really a phenomenon that was developed over centuries by the rabbinic community. Based on their understanding of the Torah, but those of us who've been studying this material for a long time have learned again and again and again how liberal and imaginative the interpretive genius of rabbinic Judaism can be and is. So what we're really looking at is the first systematic attempt representing the work, the cumulative work of several generations of rabbis spanning the better part of 300 years to organize Judaism topically into neat and identifiable categories. And we're not going to get into all the different 6 orders of the Mishnah, but the word order is right. Actually, each one of these volumes is called a Seder, like a Passover Seder, only not meaning a Passover ritual. It means an order. And each of the orders of the Mishnah is a very broad general category of Jewish thought about how to live a Jewish life, everything from agricultural practices to ritual purity practices to how to deal with women. There's a whole order on just women's issues, which is always from the male perspective, to damages, which is basically like tort law. And so on and so forth. The 6 orders of the Mishnah provide a topical framework for understanding and organizing Judaism. Pirkei Avot seems to be kind of just thrown in willy-nilly as almost like an appendix. It is this collection of wise sayings that does not seem to adhere to a single topic, but rather is a wide-ranging treatise on how to live a life that is good. And that takes us to our text for the day. So we've already blessed. So what I'm going to do is do a share screen, and that enables us to actually see all together what we're looking at. If you want to be looking at a hard copy, you can always have that by your side. And I think what I'd like to do is just put this on screen. I've kind of done a split screen thing on my screen, so it's going to be a little bit wonky today, but there's a method to my madness. So please don't be scared off by the amount of Hebrew here. We'll go through slowly, and I'll do a little translation as we go, and then we'll skip to the English. For those of you who love Hebrew, by the way, this is a wonderful reminder that the Hebrew language is actually very approachable. It's a very simple language if you know what you're doing. Okay. Kol mi sheyesh biyado shlosha devarim halalu. That's the first line. Kol, everyone, or kol mi, literally means every who, W-H-O. Everyone, sheyesh biyado, who has in his hand, or who possesses, anyone who possesses, shlosha, 3, like shalosh, divarim, things. So anyone who possesses 3 things, halalu is a fancy word meaning these. Anyone who possesses these 3 things, mitalmidav shel Avraham Avinu, belongs to the students of our father Abraham. So anyone who possesses the following three qualities is, as it were, of the disciples of Abraham. What are the three things? Ushlosha devarim acherim. We're not going to get there yet. It says, and concerning three other qualities, mitalmidav shel Balaam harasha. That person is a disciple of Balaam the wicked. Okay, so here's the framework. Those of you who've been studying Pirkei Avot with me for a long time know that there is a tendency to frame the teachings in Pirkei Avot in threes, right? Three. Why? My best guess, and I think this comes from extensive reading, is that it makes for a really solid mnemonic, right? Three things are easy to remember. So any one of these teachings is likely to be framed as a remember the following three things. So this is all very logically organized. So what we've set up now is we're going to talk about three qualities in a human being that make one person a disciple of Abraham Avinu, our father Abraham, and in distinction or contradistinction, three qualities that link a person as a descendant of Balaam Harasha, Balaam the wicked. I'm going to assume that Abraham needs no introduction to this group. Whether this is your first time or your 50th class with me, you probably know who Abraham is, the father of the Jewish people, together with Sarah, goes on to found a multitude of nations, Lech Lecha, binding of Isaac, all of those good stories. Balaam might need a little bit more introduction. If you were with me for Yizkor on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, I actually spoke about Balaam. He is one of my favorite characters. I can't remember whether he was my dad's actual bar mitzvah portion or just the one that happened to fall on the 50th anniversary of your bar mitzvah. But my dad is something of a Balaam enthusiast as well. Balaam is one of the weirdest protagonists in the Hebrew Bible. He is a sorcerer, a wizard, a soothsayer, whose special power seems to be that he's really good at issuing imprecations, fancy word for curses. And he gets hired by an employer named Balak, king of the Moabites. Now, the Moabites are among the most frequently referenced enemies of the Israelite nation. So, and they're right next door to the northeast in what is today Jordan, like around Petra, was a Moabite territory in biblical times. So the story goes in Numbers like chapter 23, 24, 25, right around there, that Balak, the king of the Moabites, wants the Israelites to fail and fall in battle. So he hires Balaam, this Gentile sorcerer, to do the dirty work for him. And he commissions this wizard to come meet him on a hilltop, gaze down at the Israelite encampment, and curse the people of Israel so that they will not prevail in battle against the Moabites. But God gets involved and decides this plan is not going to go forward because it is not good for the Jews. And God is on the side of the Israelites. Again, I'm just telling you how the story goes. So God makes for a great story. All sorts of fun obstacles are placed in the way of the sorcerer, in Balaam's way. First, he goes to mount his donkey, and his donkey refuses to ride. And I'm really shortening the story here. The donkey refuses to ride on the path, and Balaam gets angry, and he starts whipping his poor animal. Eventually, the donkey just stops dead in its tracks and says, "What the hell are you doing? Why are you beating me like this? Can't you see what I see?" And then all of a sudden, Balaam's eyes are open and notices that there is a sword-wielding angel standing in the road, blocking the path. So you have this dumb beast of burden who is much more not just visually aware, but the dumb animal sees what the seer cannot see. God actually allows Balaam to proceed with the mission, but puts a condition on the sorcerer now and says, well, here's the deal, Balaam. You can go and try to do Balak's dirty work and curse the Israelites, but you can only say the words that I put in your mouth. If you try to curse, you will instead bless. So Balaam shows up for the job. They set up a bunch of altars. They sacrifice some bulls, like you do. And King Balak says, okay, go to. And Balaam says, I'm sorry, I can only say the words that the Lord has put in my mouth. out comes a blessing instead of a curse. And this happens again and again and again in the story. And of course, Balak is enraged. That's the story. I actually view Balaam as a sympathetic figure. He's obviously a sorcerer and a charlatan. He is in some ways blind to the thing that even his donkey can see. But in other ways, I find him a sympathetic character, or at least a morally ambiguous character. The rabbis are far less charitable. In the rabbinic literature, Balaam is actually designated as one of the most wicked individuals ever to have walked the earth. So much so that, and this is why I needed to bring a kind of split screen approach here. So what I'm going to do is show on screen how I've split my screen. And now we're looking at the Pirkei Avot text on the far left, an English commentary in the middle. And what I'm most interested in is the right-hand side. Can you see where it says Mishnah Sanhedrin over here? 3 prominent kings, the right-hand column. Is that visible to everyone? Like, just kind of nod if so. Okay. This is actually from the Mishnah, this guy, on tractate Sanhedrin. 3 prominent kings mentioned in the Bible and 4 prominent commoners who are described in the Bible as men of great wisdom have no share in the world to come. In other words, they were so bad that they were excluded from the hereafter. Yes, for those of you who are new to this, the rabbis make frequent reference not only to what we have to do here in this life, but also what awaits us after this earthly existence is over. And we're going to get into that in quite some specificity today. So if this is new to you, prepare to have your head swung around a little bit. The 3 kings are Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Ahab, both of whom were kings of Israel, and Manasseh, king of Judea. Do we really need to know a lot about who these guys are? Probably not, but they're fun characters, so I'll give an extra 2 sentences. Jeroboam was among the first kings to succeed King Solomon. After Saul, David, and Solomon, who preside over a united monarchy of Israel, the Bible tells us, the kingdom split into 2, with the 10 tribes comprising Israel constituting the northern kingdom, and the lone tribe of Judea, or possibly Judea and Benjamin, comprising the southern kingdom. The Israelite kingdom is ruled first by a king who is designated as very, very wicked indeed by the Bible. His name is Jeroboam, which is also the name of a very large bottle of wine, by the way. Like you have a bottle of wine, I think is 750 milliliters, and then twice that is a Magnum, and 4 times that or something like that is a Jeroboam. I don't know why. But Jeroboam decides that it would be a swell idea to build a new shrine to God, not in Jerusalem, but in Shiloh, which is a northern city. Today, it is the city of Nablus in the West Bank. And he decides it will be a really fun idea to build some golden calves and to ask the Israelites to worship them. You can imagine how the Bible and the later rabbis give him a report card. He gets a failing grade because he deviated from the worship of Yahweh, the Israelite God, or the God of the Hebrews, in Jerusalem. There's a lot of politics that go into this as well, and history is written by the victors. So I could get off on a big tangent about who Jeroboam really was, but this will suffice. The rabbis don't like him. Similarly, Ahab, does Ahab really need any other introduction? I mean, the fact that Herman Melville uses the name Ahab as the ship captain, who is really the story's great antagonist, or some would say protagonist, probably tells you a lot about Melville's awareness of Ahab in the Hebrew Bible. He was the baddest of the bad. And Manasseh also is not given a great report card, but as you can say, he also deviates from the worship of Yahweh, and he is held responsible for the fall of the southern kingdom. Rabbi Yehuda says Manasseh does have a share in the world to come, as it is stated concerning him, and he prayed to him, meaning God, and he, meaning God, received his entreaty and heard his supplication and brought him back to Jerusalem unto his kingdom, as recorded in the biblical book of 2 Chronicles, indicating that this guy, Manasseh, repented, he made teshuvah wholeheartedly and effectively. So you have 3 kings who get a failing grade and are excluded from the hereafter on demerit alone, or maybe it was only 2 of them because Manasseh made teshuvah. The rabbi said to Rabbi Yehuda, okay, I'm going to skip down to here. The 4 commoners are these guys, Balaam, son of Beor, that's the guy we're talking about, the charlatan sorcerer, Doeg the Edomite, Achitophel, and Gehazi. These are not exactly your Sunday school greatest hits cast of characters, right? Balaam, son of Beor, Doeg the Edomite. Like, I imagine that most of us are not familiar with Doeg the Edomite. Anyone know who Doeg the Edomite was? Yeah, he was a herdsman in the retinue of the prophets, of King Saul. So he was the chief herdsman to Saul, king of Israel. And he is later depicted as having betrayed David, who is the successor or usurper to the throne, and he kills a bunch of David's priests. He's an assassin, and he stabs people with his dagger. He's a really cool character, actually. He's like this is the Game of Thrones part of the Hebrew Bible. If you've never read the books of Samuel and Kings, great read. Seriously, it's like a beach read. Well, maybe not a beach read, but Doeg the Edomite. Achitophel was a chief advisor to David who turned against him and instead took sides with David's son Absalom, who wanted to usurp the throne from David and eventually is killed. And it's the great tragedy of the David story, is that his own son tried to kill him and is killed, even though David asked for him to be kept alive. Achitophel was the advisor who turned coat. And then finally, the last, so you got Gehazi is the assistant to the prophet Elisha, who also betrays the prophet and turns to the other side. So you have these three figures who are traitors, or four figures, and Balaam is among them. So Balaam, this sorcerer, is considered very, very wicked. That is a very long way of unpacking one line of Pirkei Avot, but I felt that it would be helpful because we're going to get into what are the qualities of character that the Bible associates with Abraham, and what are the qualities of character that the Bible associates with Balaam. So now let's go finally to Pirkei Avot, and hooray, we're going to do this in English. I'm going to bring the text back up, and then I'll open the floor to conversation. Whoever possesses these three things, we're looking in the left-hand side now, he is, and this is written in a gender-insensitive way, one is of the disciples of Abraham, our father. And whoever possesses these three other things or qualities, that person is of the disciples of Balaam the wicked. What are the good things? A good eye. In Hebrew, it is ayin hatov. If you follow my little cursor here, ayin tova, rather, right here, ayin tova. A humble spirit and a moderate appetite. That person is of the disciples of Abraham, our father. An evil eye, a haughty spirit, and a limitless appetite, a glutton, that person is of the disciples, the wicked, the disciples of Balaam the wicked. What is the difference between the disciples of Abraham, our father, and the disciples of Balaam the wicked? The disciples of Abraham, our father, enjoy this world and inherit the world to come, which I don't like that translation. I would say the next phase of our existence is a better translation, or the hereafter. As it is said in Proverbs, I will endow those who love me with substance. I will fill their treasuries. We're going to unpack all of this, so please don't panic that this is a lot. Proverbs chapter 8. But the disciples of Balaam, the wicked, inherit Gehinnom. We'll talk about that. And descend into the nethermost pit, as it is said, for you, O God, will bring them down to the nethermost pit, those murderous and treacherous men. They shall not live out half their days. But I, in contrast, trust in you. All right. Let's unpack a little bit. What are the three admirable qualities that we're talking about? They are a good eye, a humble spirit, and a moderate appetite. And their analogue or opposite are the qualities associated with wickedness. Right? So this is a very long poetic way of setting up three things you should remember are the essence of a good life or good character. In ayin tova, whatever a good eye means, we're going to talk about that. A humble bearing and what was the third one? A limited appetite, a moderate appetite. Those indicate a person of high moral standing, like Abraham. The other three, a wicked eye or an evil eye, a haughty bearing, and a limitless appetite, a gluttonous appetite, those resemble Balaam the wicked. We're really getting down to the core of the text. This is what it intends to teach. Everything else was just supplement, commentary, background. All right, Mom and Dad, you've got your hand up, so why don't you chime in first? Just kindly unmute yourself and take it away.
Just as an aside, there are some translations that would have Balaam as being a one-eyed wizard, Shatum Ha'ayin, that he actually had a pit where one eye should be.
Right. I actually
evil eye is very interesting. He had only one eye.
Yeah. Right. And of course, it was used for sorcery. Yeah, there is an interesting phrase that Balaam uses when referring to himself in his prophetic or wizarding capacity. He refers himself as Balaam Shatum Ha'ayin, which literally means the guy with the eye socket, or the guy with one eye. There are some, my dad is aware of this, and my dad is like a self-professed Balaam expert. No, he studied this parsha. He wrote about it for the 50th anniversary of his bar mitzvah at WRT. Dad gave the Devar Torah and chanted Torah that night. So Shtum Ha'ayin, some have actually said means the guy was a cyclops. So it is funny that he is given an evil eye, though most of us are aware that the Ayin Hara in Judaism, or the Ein Hara, or even more colloquially from the Hebrew through Yiddish, the phrase Ein Ahora, right? Kenahora, is Ayin Hara, which literally means as goes the evil eye, or like the evil eye. It is a superstitious phrase that one recites, Kenahora, so as not to incur divine misfortune, or I would just say supernatural misfortune. So in Judaism, it is superstitiously customary not to acknowledge how great something is without doing this little ke'enahora, saying, God forbid, by acknowledging this blessing in my life, all of a sudden it will turn into a curse, right? So my grandmother is 97 years old, ke'enahora. You say it like that, so as not to invite misfortune, bad luck. It's a superstition, right? Kanahara, that boy eats and eats and eats and never gains weight. Kanahara. Okay. Russell, comment. Or Judy.
For whatever it's worth, when I was a little kid, my grandmother told me a different meaning of Kanahara. Which is, she said it came from the Yiddish, sie können hören, meaning they can hear, the evil spirits can hear.
Whoa, that's pretty cool.
I have a question, because in my translation, the Hertz translation, of course the numbers are basically different, but it says, I guess, a good eye, a humble mind, and a lowly spirit. Yeah. So just wondered what might be the difference, or is it just depending upon when it was translated?
Great. So the actual Hebrew for this is really fascinating. Ayin tova is fairly simple to translate, a good eye, but what it means is hard to translate. V'ruach nimucha literally means a lowly or a diminished spirit. Namuch means like contracted or short, literally short spirit. And ruach can mean a lot of different things. Ruach literally means breath or wind, but it doesn't mean shortness of breath. Clearly that's not what is meant here. It can also mean spirit in terms of one's character, one's personality. So a ruach nimucha, most translators think means a lowly spirit, not in the sense of self-abnegating, but the opposite of self-inflating, right? One who is loath to puff oneself up has a ruach nimucha. And I used puff oneself up deliberately because it connotes that breath business in ruach, right? This idea that you're not puffed up. That's ruach nimucha. The third quality is a nefesh shfala. Really hard to get at that. Literally means a lowly body. But again, it's not about your physique. A nefesh is also a soul. So a lowly soul, and shafal literally means kind of like prostrate, not prostate, prostrate. Like one who is shafal literally means that one lowers oneself. So all three of these seem to have to do with similar qualities of not make, or at least the last two, not puffing yourself up, not arrogating yourself above others, not being haughty or egotistical. I don't think mind is a great translation of either ruach or nefesh. So I don't think that lowly mind really gets at the thrust of this passage here, Judy.
Thanks a lot.
Yep. Michelle.
So I think these are a little, sorry, I think these are a little bit easier to understand in the negative ones than in the positive ones. Just to start with the, look, I think we know, as you just described, we know what the evil eye is. It's cursing, putting a curse on someone or something like that, right? Or some invoking
Which is why it
evil spirit.
works. Which is why it works so well with Balaam, by the way. He was a cursor.
Right. On the positive, in the English idiom of a good eye refers to, we use the evil eye in English. The English idiom of a good eye means something completely different. This person has a sense of style. They pick out art well. They, things along those lines. So I'm trying to interpret that in terms of contrary to the, in contrast to the, to the negative, as opposed to, what it says to me other than that. Hang on a second while I push the cat out of the way.
Yes.
She wants to be part of this. The contrast, but overall, what strikes me more is that these are kind of middle paths, sets of middle path on the goal. Yeah, the bad guys are really bad, but what you really want is a to be a moderate, to be in between. This is not ascetic. You can have a moderate appetite. This is
right.
Humble, but not self-abnegating,
Right.
not bragging, but not the other way. So I'm
yeah, your line of thought, and thank you, Michelle, is exactly in line with where Maimonides goes on this. Maimonides wrote an extensive and complete commentary to all of Pirkei Avot. And Maimonides is, first and foremost, at least in terms of his philosophy, he is a direct descendant of Aristotelian thinking. So in line with what Aristotle taught, the golden mean is a through line of the virtue that Maimonides preaches. Effectively, Maimonides consistently, and especially here in his commentary to Pirkei Avot, and especially here in his commentary to Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah number 19, talks a lot about the golden mean as the summation of what an ethical and good life looks like. It really is a life of consistent and rigorous moderation, never doing too much, never doing too little. So, and that informs so much of Maimonidean thought. The classic example is like Maimonides' so-called ladder of tzedakah. Most of us know that Maimonides instructs that it is, the Jewish precept is to give 10% of one's income to tzedakah. But most of us don't know that he also said one may not give more than 20% of one's income to tzedakah. That's because one should never jeopardize one's ability to put food on the table. So Maimonides is always preaching a Torah of moderation. And I think you're right. The rabbis also try to unpack what is meant by a good eye, just because the evil eye is a thing we're familiar with. What is a good eye? And they actually reframe the concept not to be about cursing or superstition, but to be about generosity and greed. And one of the qualities that they identify most closely with Abraham is generosity. And if you look, for instance, at the stories about Abraham in Genesis, generosity really shows up as a prominent character feature of Abraham. For instance, in chapter 18, he opens his tent with Sarah to the messengers who visit his home. He offers them water, he bathes their feet, and he prepares a generous feast for them. Then when he is going to purchase a grave for Sarah after she dies, he is exceedingly humble with the people. He says to the Hittites, who are the owners of the land where he's trying to purchase the cave of Machpelah, he says, I am but a sojourner among you. In other words, I know that I don't have any VIP standing among you. Very humble, even though elsewhere we learn he was kind of a big shot in the ancient Near East. And then finally, the business about Abraham's moderate appetite is actually from a midrash on Genesis chapter 12. According to the midrash, Abraham was very modest in how he approached Sarah, and until they were married, did not acknowledge what a beautiful woman she is. And so there's all of these fun rabbinic legends about that make Abraham's generosity, humility, and modesty a twice-told tale. Russell, your turn to chime in.
Well, thank you very much. I've been thinking a bit about the good eye. And also in mindful of what Michelle said, because summed up when she spoke of taste and all that, behind all of that is discernment, the ability to make distinctions. I often remind myself of the creation story in Genesis. At the end of every day, doesn't say that God made it good. He said God saw it was good. Mm-hmm. Goodness is what God sees in us, and the ability to see goodness where it is, I think, is a godly quality.
That's a beautiful read on Ayin Tovah, by the way, what a good eye could mean.
So that is what comes to my mind with beautiful. The concept of, of a good eye. It's discernment. It's the ability to recognize good. And evil eye is someone who can't even recognize good when it's
lovely.
There.
Beautiful. Love that.
I'm a little troubled by generosity in Abraham when it comes to the Akedah, but that's another, that's another argument that I would have with you. And when it comes to appetites, are all appetites bad? Is an appetite for knowledge something that, or wisdom, or beauty, is that something that necessarily needs to be restrained? But I guess that's the third of these prongs.
Yeah, and I think that I get this only by way of inference and not from anything explicitly referenced in the text, that the kind of appetite that seems to be singled out for either virtue when in moderation or vice when in excess is not an appetite for the things that are ennobling or enlightening, but rather the things that satiate biological impulses, or impulses for power, wealth, prestige, sex, food. And this is consistent with a number of other teachings, both in the Torah itself, which puts forth all sorts of warnings about the dangers of installing a monarch in the book of Deuteronomy. If you do this, Moses says, you got to be careful. He's going to want to have a stable of horses, and he's going to want to go back to Egypt to get them, and he's going to want to have a harem of wives and concubines, and he's going to amass money to excess, and there is no way to provide a person with that much power and authority without incurring the kind of greed and appetite that is the precursor to tyranny and disaster for the people. And that is exactly what happens, of course. So I would say that, there is biblical precedent for warning about the dangers of immoderation in both appetite and attitude. Dad, you want to chime in here, and then we'll do a little bit more of this text.
There is at least one notable exception to moderation as being the approach that you should take, and the Shema and its blessings. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha
Right. Right.
So
Yeah,
in
but
the love of God, you are not to be moderate.
True. Although, looking around the world, including at some examples from within the Jewish tradition and the Jewish people, both historically and today, I would actually argue that religion and religious devotion and love of one's God can be carried to an immoderate extreme that leads to danger as well.
No argument there.
Right. All things in moderation, perhaps except moderation, that it is not the worst thing in the world to eat the whole chocolate cake yourself once in a while. Okay. So we've now set up at least the three qualities. And again, we spent some time on Abraham. Balaam is just held up as a convenient counterpoint, or antilogue would be the word, the opposite, where Abraham is seen as ayin tovah in the sense of generous. Balaam is seen as greedy. This guy would do anything for a buck, right? He'd curse the Israelites, heedless of what that actually would mean or lead to in terms of his spiritual fate, in terms of how he was going to be remembered. I talked about this at Yizkor. The regret of Balaam is the theme I isolated in the story, but that is obviously not what the rabbis pick up here. They say this guy was a charlatan who could be bought and sold for money. He was haughty in that he thought he single-handedly had the power to curse a nation, and God foiled him and made a fool of him for that. And he had enormous appetite for power, for recognition. And again, God puts him on display as the fool that he is seen to be in the narrative. So he really is the anti-Abraham in the rabbinic imagination. I personally might never have thought to put Abraham and Balaam next to each other as character studies in contrast, but the rabbis, I also love the way in which the rabbis want their pupils, and that, as we've said many times in our Pirkei Avot study, who is the intended audience of Pirkei Avot? Probably the original intended audience were young rabbis in training, yeshiva bochers, right? Young boys who were studying to be rabbis. But Pirkei Avot has passed into the Jewish lingua franca as a book for the common person as well. And that's why we're studying it. It is not my expectation that we're all training to be rabbis. It is my expectation and hope that we all can find wisdom in Pirkei Avot that actually gives us new insights into how Judaism frames the life well lived. And inasmuch, I love the creativity of using Abraham and Balaam and not just saying, if you want to be a good person, be generous, be humble, and be moderate of appetite. That would have been sufficient. But there's a delight in this literature in using biblical figures and bringing them to life as dimensional characters who should be studied and modeled either in the positive or in the negative for what they teach us about character. I just love that. Like, for me, that is a vivid way of teaching Torah, to help people relate to biblical characters, not as infallible superhumans, but rather as dimensional beings who have a lot to teach us about what it means to lead a life of character. Okay, and so we proceed. So what we're looking at now is the second half of that text. We actually read it, but I'll summarize. So the interesting thing is that they don't just let it rest with, here are the virtues that you should model in Abraham, here are the vices that you should shun in Balaam. They go on to say that there's more than just your earthly existence at stake. They say that those who model the character traits of Abraham will merit the olam haba, the world to come, and those who model the character vices of Balaam will merit, the word, do you remember they used, is gehinom, or abbreviated down in Jewish colloquial parlance to Gehenna, which is a word you probably have heard. It's hell. But Gehenna is a contraction of two Hebrew words, ge, which means a valley, and hinom, which is an actual place on the southern slope of Jerusalem, both ancient and modern. Right now, you can actually, many of us have been to Israel, so this may be familiar. Some of us more recently than others. It's been 3.5 years since I've been. I can't wait to go back in 2023. God willing, get to lead 2 temple trips, one for high school seniors this coming February, and one for the whole congregation. Put it on your calendars. All ages, all stages, ages 6 to 106 next December. We intend to visit all of these sites that the Bible references, including Gehenna. I'm going to say, hey, today we're taking a trip to hell. What was it? Well, it's today known as Sultan's Pool. It's a valley just at the foot of the southern slope of Jerusalem that now is used as a kind of outdoor amphitheatrical concert venue and like place to just hang out and have a drink in the park on a cool summer's day. But in ancient times, the prophet Jeremiah and others tell us that it was used as a site for burning children alive as sacrifices to the Canaanite fire god Molech. And so this place, Gei Hinnom, the real place, the Valley of Hinnom, became associated with the most wicked kind of idolatry and death and everything that the Jewish tradition will come to inveigh against. I spoke about this at some length on Rosh Hashanah morning, in light of child sacrifice and archaeological evidence that it was in fact practiced in places like Gei Hinnom and elsewhere. But when the rabbis refer to Gei Hinnom, they're not talking about a physical place. They are talking about eternal damnation. Now, this is where modern Jews who grew up in a Reform or even a conservative synagogue might say, whoa, Rabbi, this is really out there. This does not resemble anything that I would ever associate with Judaism. And I have endeavored over my rabbinate to make it clear that the reason that so many of us never grew up hearing about traditions of afterlife or heaven and hell, even though they have specifically Jewish terminologies and mean something substantially enough different from the way they are used in Christian theology and literature. We have our own versions of these. We call heaven Gan Eden, which means the Garden of Eden, and we call hell Gehenna or Gei Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, where these awful child sacrifices in fire to the god Molech were conducted. It really is in there. And the reason you might not have encountered it is that the Reform movement in the 19th century did an outstanding job of extirpating these traditions from Judaism, making it clear that these were noxious superstitions that belonged to a primitive age, unsuitable to the enlightened era of the 19th century, the post-Enlightenment era in which they were living, in which a universal brotherhood of man under the unchallenged rule of God would prevail. They had a very optimistic view of how far we had come as a species and as a civilization, a Jewish civilization, and they wanted to remove from our tradition any vestige of something that struck them as a relic of old superstitious practices. And that included, they had a very broad, well, they took a machete, not a scalpel, to the tradition. So they will take out of the prayer book all references to Gan Eden and Gehenna, which are in the traditional prayer book. They took out all references to returning to the land of Israel because they were anti-Zionist. And, well, many of them were pre-Zionist. There was no Zionist movement until the latter half of the 19th century, but many of them said, why would we want to go back to this dusty old Middle Eastern backwater? We're living in the new Garden of Eden. We're living in the Promised Land right now here in Germany in 1843. Okay, well, what difference a century will make? So for these Jews, for these early reformers and their followers, this persists for, 100 years or so, from the very first decades of the 19th century to the first decades of the 20th century. And there are even some today who really carry proudly this banner of Reform Judaism standing first and foremost for a religion of reason, where anything that smacks of superstition or ritual practice without an ethical component to it ends up on the cutting room floor. Ritual dress, ritual diet, ritual hairstyles, anything that allowed the Jews to be seen as different, unassimilated, boorish, culturally naive, anything less than the sophisticated benchmark of what they viewed as elevated or the highest form of society, which was early 19th century German society, met with their ire and was cut from the tradition. So effectively, as a matter of fact, that many of us grow up not understanding that these concepts are deeply rooted in rabbinic thought. That's what I wanted to say about that, and I'm happy to take comments or thoughts or questions. Mara. Oh, just unmute yourself. Yeah, there you go.
So what happens to Reformed Jews when they die? If we're taking all that superstitious stuff out.
Well, they would say this happens to all people when they die.
Okay.
Right. What do Reformed Jews believe about what happens when we die? Well, look, I'm going to try and model one of the attributes of Abraham and be very, very humble here and say, I don't know. I don't know what happens to us when we die. And when I teach this material specific, I've taught some of you have taken this, I've taught a class on death, afterlife, and immortality within Judaism. By the way, there's even substantial Jewish literature on resurrection. And it's at least as old as resurrection ideas in early Christianity. It's just that it kind of goes underground. Resurrection in particular, as you can imagine, as Christianity grew, became more and more furtive, taboo in Judaism, but it never disappeared. Even today, there are sects of Hasidic Judaism that are big into bodily resurrection. Okay, so what happens when we die, according to Reform Judaism? Well, first of all, I don't know what happens when we die. Someday, I look forward to finding out, or not. Reform Judaism is a tradition that tends not to be rigorously dogmatic when it comes to what we do or should believe. What I can say is that, Judaism has these notions that this earthly existence as we experience it here and now, this embodied existence, is not all there is to our existence. What came before, what comes after, is a matter upon which religious thinkers and philosophers have long speculated. There's plenty of room within Reform Judaism for a belief system that speaks about an existence that is made up of both body and soul, and that there is the material component to our existence, matter, right? Flesh, blood, cells. And there is the immaterial part, the ethereal or the soul, which lives on after us, which may be lived before us, lived in not a biological sense, but in a spiritual sense. How you choose to understand that, whether more literally or more figuratively, is very much, like most matters in Reform Judaism, a matter of personal choice. For me, I'm totally comfortable with language of soul, with the language of immortality, with the language of even olam haba. But for me, these are all just poetic metaphors for talking about the way in which our embodied existence in this meat suit is not all there is. Both from a biological or a physical perspective, a scientific perspective, I think I can back up that claim, and also from a spiritual perspective. So you're just asking one Reform rabbi. So I'll tell you what I think. I existed in this form only as of September 20th, 1973, or 9 months before, in progress, right? But within me, in addition to my physical incorporation, I contain everything I've ever learned and experienced from people who were around long before me. So I have within me not just the DNA of my ancestors, but also the teachings of my ancestors. So when I'm sitting here in dialogue with you and reading literature that is 2,000 years old, well, that's very much a part of who I am or who I've become. And therefore I, as Walt Whitman once said, and Bob Dylan memorably quoted in the first song off of his newest album, Rough and Rowdy Ways, I contain multitudes, right? I'm more than just this body. I am everything that I was ever taught. I am the sum total of all the relationships I've ever had. I am very much not the same person I would have been had I never met my wife. And God willing, I will leave some kind of imprint on some small corner of the world that will persist after this is no more. I find that very comforting. I am not sure that when I talk about my soul, I'm thinking about a formless thing flitting about, waiting to find another body to enter. I do think that maybe someday someone will find these YouTube videos and learn Torah from me, who never met me in real life, and maybe even who was born after I died. And I take great comfort in knowing that for me, if I talk about that being my soul, like if my soul is found in the Torah I teach, awesome. If there's a kid out there who one day as a great grandparent tells her great granddaughter about her bat mitzvah with me, awesome. And I don't mean to over personalize this. I'm using this only as an example of a thought exercise that we all can use about how we can reclaim some of these metaphors. And I really think that the rabbis have a high capacity for metaphor. The Torah itself has a high capacity for metaphor. Anyone who tells you that they're a Bible fundamentalist is just dumb. And you can challenge that notion right and left, because the Bible speaks in poetic and metaphorical language. You know, when the Bible says, and you shall follow these laws and you shall not deviate to the right or to the left, well, they don't literally mean walking in a straight line and swerving. It's a metaphor for follow the law rigorously. That's just one of countless examples in the Torah where you can say, you really believe that it means literally you're not supposed to walk on the left or the right side of an actual road? You know, so, and that's probably not even the most illustrative example I could offer. So when the rabbis talk about this olam haba business, especially recognizing that the word olam does not usually mean a physical domain, but rather it is a temporal term. It's a term that applies to time. Olam is best expressed as eternity, not realm so much, but duration. Olam haba, the time to come. I like the hereafter. I prefer the terms olam hazeh, the here and now, and olam haba, the hereafter. We get a bunch of years, maybe decades, please God, maybe a lot of decades in the here and now, where we get to be these wonderful embodied beings that can enjoy chocolate lava cake and Mozart, to name but two of my favorites, and then not anymore. The other thing I'll say is that in sharp distinction to Christianity, sharp contradistinction to Christianity, Judaism never actually puts this stuff front and center. And that is not a subtle difference. And so some of this is just about what matters in Judaism, right, overall. In my view, the more I've studied Judaism, the more I say, yeah, these concepts come up. They are rooted indigenously in Jewish soil or Jewish intellectual soil, Jewish spiritual soil. The ideas are native to Judaism, but they never take center stage the way they do in Christianity. The essence of Judaism, if one can argue this, and that's hard to say about a 3,000-year-old civilization that has spanned the globe and has been incarnated in so many different variations on a theme, even today. You know, the way Moroccan Jews practice Judaism is really different from the way Scarsdale Jews practice Judaism. The way Scarsdale Jews practice Judaism at Young Israel of Scarsdale is very different from the way Scarsdale Jews practice their Judaism at Westchester Reformed Temple. But with all that variation, nowhere in Judaism, with very few exceptions, historically or today, is what happens in the hereafter the central concern of our tradition. And that is not true for Christianity. I would argue that what happens after we die is a central concern in much Christianity globally today and historically throughout the world. And that's again, you may not like the fact that I've made that distinction as subtle as I have, but I think it's not subtle at all. It's really important. It's in there. It's just not on the front and center. It's not the first and most important thing we learn. Okay, Arlene. Unmute yourself kindly.
It's hard for me to follow anything in terms of what you've just said, but this is a very minor observation. My first trip to Israel, we had a Jewish guide who took us to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then actively began to talk about Judaism at the time that Jesus was alive and how many believed in bodily resurrection. And I was shocked.
Yeah.
And I could not believe that that was truthful at all. And I went home after our trip and I began to research it. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. Never was it focused on before whenever I attended Reform Judaism temples. Right. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and it's true. And look, I think that bodily resurrection is not indigenous to Judaism or Christianity. It's a much more ancient pagan idea. It crops up in lots of different cultures and civilizations, from the ancient Sumerians to the Babylonians to, and I don't know much about non-Western civilization. But in the West, or in the ancient Near East, which really is the kind of germ cell of Western civilization, at least from a religious perspective, bodily resurrection is very much a part of cultic belief systems. And so much so that, for instance, the Hebrew month of Tammuz is like usually June, July-ish. It's the month right before Av, the saddest month of the year, in which we commemorate the destruction of the temple on the 9th of Av, or Tisha B'Av. Tammuz was the name of a Babylonian god, lowercase g, at least from my perspective, who died every summer and was resurrected again in the spring. And all of these ancient fertility rituals were linked to agriculture, right? So the god idea in many ancient cultic cults or religions was an embodiment of what they saw happening in the cycles of life and agriculture. Produce grows, thrives, and then withers and dies. And if God is actually the animated force making all of that happening, or you worship the God of agriculture, the God of the corn, the God of the wheat, the God of the sun, the God of the moon, if you are in a polytheistic framework, the idea of a God who dies and who is then resurrected is very deeply in touch with nature cults, because it mimics the cycle of agricultural life and prosperity. And by praying for the God to be resurrected, you were really praying, could the rain and the crops come back for next year, please, so that my family won't starve. It's not a far stretch from that to believing that a bodily resurrection awaits human beings as well. And again, I think Judaism complicates the mix by saying, well, it's all dependent on things like how good a person you are. Like, Judaism's unique contribution to cultic belief is morality, I would argue. We're not the first. You have things like the Code of Hammurabi and other ancient Near Eastern law codes, which do touch on ethics, meaning the field of thought around what is the right thing, what is the wrong thing to do, what is good, what is bad. But Judaism really, I think, is the first and most comprehensive attempt to merge religious or spiritual thought with ethical thought, and to make our spiritual destiny contingent upon our morality. And Christianity takes that even further, though. Again, we're not here to talk Christianity. I'm going to go to Norm Weiss and then Mom and Dad, and we've spent all day on one text, and that's good, by the way. That's all good. I always want the conversation to be deep, not to read in a cursory way. And there's so much. This is one of the most complicated of all of the Mishnahs we're going to look at in this study. And it's a great way back for those who've been studying with me for a while. I hope this was a meaningful adventure for those who are joining me for the first time. And I'm very open to your feedback, by the way. We're going to end in 15 minutes. I just want to give a heads up that if I said anything, if this felt it was a little over one's head, you can privately message me just to say, hey, could I have a little help with this? I want to come back, but I felt a little bit out of my depth. And if it was a little bit too much review, you can tell me that too. But I'm really I want this class to be as open and embracing to all learners as it can be. Norm, why don't you chime in next, please?
Thanks. Arlene made me think of this. The first time I was in Israel, at my grandfather's request, I brought him back a little sack of earth from the Mount of Olives. I assume, I don't know for sure, that he probably was buried with this. The idea being that to have this in his coffin was a shortcut when the Messiah came and there'd be a resurrection of the dead. He would be on his way because of that.
100%. It is one of many vestiges of Jewish practice today that links directly to beliefs in bodily resurrection and an afterlife. Absolutely. And many people don't know that. And many people request that their loved ones, because it's just something that most funeral directors just say, hey, you want some dirt from Israel in there with your loved one? Sorry, that's my impression. That's my bad impression of a New York funeral director. No one I know personally, of course. I love funeral director. No, I only love one funeral director, but that's a different story. Two. I love two funeral directors. I have a few who are not my favorite people. Anyway, that's a tangent. Yeah, so most people don't explain what that's all about. And by the way, okay, when I die, do I want some dirt from Israel with me? Sure. Not because I think it couldn't hurt on my potential for resurrection, but more because it's a beautiful way of reminding myself and my loved ones, my community, that, I was born a Jew and I intend to die a Jew. And to be a Jew is to be part of a people, and part of a people with a home. And that, unfortunately, is a concept that is under quite some scrutiny today, and to which I remain deeply and devotedly committed. Mom and Dad, comment.
First, I want to thank Norman for reminding me that my parents, as Sally and my stepfather Ellis, actually did that on their first trip to Israel. I remember them showing me the sacks of Israeli soil that they wanted to be buried with. But yeah. my larger point goes back to, what happens after we die. That question we've been, only we're the first people who ever struggled with that, I'm sure. But I'm always reassured and so happy to be part of an ethical and religious tradition which treats science as part of the divine method of the cosmos. And as Carl Sagan famously said, we are made of star stuff. Our molecules were made in stars, presumably unto stars they will return. So there is something, even in the nature of the cosmos, that speaks to more dimensions that we experience at this time.
The great, this is a follow-up to your comment. Thank you. The great essayist, chemist, and Holocaust survivor, Primo Levi of blessed memory, who wrote a number of profound and striking essays and memoirs, including Survival in Auschwitz, I believe is one of his magnum opuses. My favorite work by Primo Levi is called The Periodic Table. It is very personal. It is very indebted to his similar understanding to yours, Dad, that Judaism, to quote the great Flemish poet and essayist Edmund Flegge, spelled F-L-E-G, but pronounced with a soft G, not Edmund Flegge, who actually was an expatriate in Paris, and you can see his apartment there. He wrote a wonderful poem that many of us remember from being enshrined in the old Gates of Prayer book, I am a Jew because to be Jewish requires no abdication of the mind. I think that's the first line of the poem. It's just wonderful. So yeah, I square entirely with your view that Judaism and science are not irreconcilable, but actually harmoniously indebted each to the other. And that's a Maimonidean view. I can't say that every Jewish exponent believes that, but they should. Okay, but I say that because Primo Levi's book, The Periodic Table, is on the one hand a personal memoir, an autobiography, and on the other hand, a meditation on the elements of the periodic table. So each chapter is a reflection or a meditation on one of the elements of the periodic table and how that element somehow figures in his life story. So one of the things he was conscripted to do in the death camps, he was actually put in a labor camp where he was put in charge of manufacturing paints and other solvents as a chemist for the Nazi war effort. And so he reflects on some element that it might have been cobalt, that is an essential component of the particular blue paint that he needed for some or other nefarious Nazi enterprise. The last chapter of the book is called Carbon. It's probably my single favorite piece of short form literature. It's absolutely astonishing. And basically, you've read this whole autobiography, and then at the end, he tells the story of a single carbon atom. And I don't want to say more, but it's very much, it is both scientific and autobiographical. Yeah, I don't know if it exists online. Just look up Carbon, Primo Levi, Levi. It will blow your mind. It's just absolutely genius. It's just so good. Pretty much everything that you ever need to know about what I believe is the essay Carbon. And it's my spirituality. Sandy Edlitz. Just unmute yourself kindly. Yep, there you go.
Hi. So these references, as you put it, to the hereafter.
Yeah.
This is the first time I'm ever really hearing this discussed, and I think it's important to understand. And I guess the Hebrew teaching with which I'm most familiar is the Torah. And I don't know that, tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm missing something, but I don't think that idea is expressed.
Correct.
In Torah.
Right. So a few comments. Thank you, Sandy. First of all, thank you for acknowledging that this is new news, and that's wonderful. For me, the joy in teaching is largely about making discoveries, even when they stretch us out of our comfort zones, which are comfortable because they're familiar, right? That's what comfort is, usually. But the unfamiliar is delightful, even when it stretches us, even when it's uncomfortable. So a couple of thoughts. One, again, I want to emphasize that while these ideas are indigenous within Judaism, they are not necessarily ever dominant, nor are they definitive of what I think Judaism is really trying to teach. And that's it's unfair to make any generalizations about what Judaism teaches. People, what does a Jew believe about, what does Judaism teach about this? I'm like, well, how many years do you have to study with me? But having said that, that is not the dominant thrust. And I'm going to quote Michelle Braun, who I think very helpfully among the other very enjoyable tidbits that you put, I don't know, enjoyable is the right word, but meaningful tidbits that you put in the chat window. You mentioned, Michelle, that this text that we're looking at today is actually not about how to get into the hereafter. It is predominantly about character traits that are virtuous.
Right.
That's the point, right? That's what this text is here to teach. Don't get so hung up on the language of olam haba that you miss the greater point, which is this is about cultivation of human virtue in the here and now. Right. And this is another key difference between Christianity and Judaism. It's not just that Christianity puts a spotlight on the hereafter or puts it on a pedestal or puts it in the center of the Christian framework for the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. It is also that And this is not a fair assessment of all of Christianity. The same way I don't like making blanket statements or generalizations about Judaism, I don't like making them about Christianity, and especially in the politically fraught environment in which we currently find ourselves on this subject of conversation, I really don't like making generalizations about Islam, because you get people very worked up. But on the subject of Christianity, I think it is fair to say that by and large, one's character and one's works, one's deeds, one's mitzvot in the Jewish system, or one's works in the Christian frame, are not the essential determinant of admission to heaven or hell. It is largely about your willingness to be saved by Jesus through faith, at least in Catholicism, which is the trunk of Christianity. I mean, Protestantism, which is the dominant form of Christianity in the United States and always has been, is nevertheless a relatively recent religious phenomenon, 500 plus minus years old, since the Reformation. And Protestantism, there are lots of Protestantisms, and there are lots of Catholicisms, but you can't divorce Christianity today or historically from the idea of salvation through faith in Jesus, who is the Christ, the Savior. Whereas in Judaism, even when we're having a dialogue that revolves around this idea of a hereafter, a here and now versus a hereafter, a here and now in relationship with a hereafter, it's never divorced from how we live here and now. It is not a question of all can be redeemed through faith. It is always a question of, well, what are you going to do between now and when when your corporeal form is gone? And in this case, it is a sermon, a mini sermon, on the attributes of Ayin Tovah, Ruach Shfala, and Ruach Numucha, and Nefesh Shfala. A good eye, whatever that may mean. And I love the Russellian interpretation that a good eye means the ability to acknowledge and see what is good. That is actually a discipline within Judaism that I talked about on Kol Nidre. You can read all of my sermons now on my blog at rabbiblake.org. I talked about the ability to acknowledge the good even before you offer your first complaint of the day. That is a spiritual discipline. To wake up in the morning and isolate 3 things you want to say I'm thankful for before you have your first fetch. Takes practice, by the way. I don't always succeed. I do regularly try. Hakarat hatov, seeing the good, acknowledging the good. Or, in the more conventional interpretation of that phrase, generosity. A good eye means your ability to extend yourself beyond your physical self to what you can see with goodness. A humble spirit, or a lowly spirit, and a modest appetite. Do that. And by the way, it doesn't even tell you first and foremost that you're going to get into the hereafter. It says that really puts you in the company of Abraham. And that's kind of an astonishing statement too. It's like you don't have to be Abraham to be like Abraham in Judaism. And this is something else I really emphasize, and this will be my concluding note after Sandy's comment, is we are not asked to be Abraham, and yet at the same time, our tradition wants to make it clear that what made Abraham great was not the fact that he founded a new nation, not the fact that he founded a multitude of peoples, not the fact that he protested the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by arguing with God. It is that he was a person with, he was righteous the way you can be righteous, right? He had a good eye, a humble spirit, and a modest appetite. I love that about Judaism. I think that is subtly profound. Sandy, you get the last class comment of the day, and then I'll finish up.
Not a comment, still a question. So is this idea of the afterlife, the world, the here, how do you say it?
The hereafter.
Hereafter. And I remember there's something called Sheol, which I guess is...
Right. Oh, yes. Thank you. You asked this question. The Bible does not mention the hereafter. It does talk about the pit or Sheol, which is like the dark shadow underrealm of the world, which is not particularly distinguishable from graves where dead people go.
So is this idea of the world after or the hereafter, is it gospel?
In the sense of, is it embraced as kind of an inviolable truth within Judaism?
Yes, is it?
No, but it is commonplace enough in rabbinic literature that I want to make it clear that it's not off stage, it's just stage left, right?
Okay.
It's not center stage.
Right.
It's not behind the scenes, even though the reform movement put some extra stage directions to get out of here. You're distracting us from the pure religion that God and Moses were all about. I don't think that the reformers were accurate when they made those maneuvers, but they were certainly operating within a sensible framework in the post-Enlightenment European milieu in which they were operating. The same Enlightenment era that gave rise to important seminal documents in the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's Enlightenment thinking. That is definitely not medieval European thinking. And it is very much linked to early reform thinking. Having said all of that, it's stage left. It's still there. It's just not center stage. And thank you for allowing me to come back to your original question. It is not biblically indigenous, right? It is rabbinic thought, and how much it arises in response to early Christianity is really a matter of some fascinating speculation. It could well be that some of this was early rabbis saying, no, you don't have to become a follower of Jesus to have this whole idea of an afterlife. We've got that too. Stick with us. We're the Jews. Okay, on that note, my friends, I wish you a Chag Sameach. I hope that the rest of your Sukkot is wonderful. And please join us at 4 o'clock on Sunday for a really sweet, very fun Simchat Torah celebration where we'll have the Billy Jonas Band. It's great for all ages, especially if you have little people in your lives, but it is not kids only. We will do a consecration of our youngest learners, and having learners who are not young there to cheer them on is really what this temple thing is all about. And most importantly, we will perform a beautiful, sweet little installation ritual for Rabbi Leah Citron, who's our new educator and director of the Jewish Learning Lab. And she grew up at WRT. Now she is the director of the lab, and she's awesome. I'm one of our new rabbis. And we'll have a really nice catered Israeli supper afterward with music, live music. It's going to be fun. 4 to 6:30 on Sunday afternoon. Please come. Do register online, either through the website or through the Temple e-blast, which hit your inboxes this morning. I wish all of you.
Indoors or outdoors?
The dinner's going to be outside. The ritual will be indoors.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach, my friends.
Chag Sameach,
Thank you.
Yasher
guys.
Koach, John. Yasher
Good to
Koach.
you. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.